Some doors don't just keep the cold out, they keep your life from falling apart. The wind hit it again, harder this time, and the loose wooden door slammed against the frame with a hollow crack that echoed through the narrow hallway like something breaking that couldn't be fixed with tape or patience. Emily Carter pressed her shoulder against it, one hand gripping the rusted knob, the other bracing the warped wood as the November air slipped through every crack it could find, cold and sharp against her skin. Somewhere behind her, a small voice stirred. "Mom!" A soft cough followed, thin and tired. Emily closed her eyes for half a second, just enough to steady herself, then tightened her grip. "It's okay, baby. Go back to sleep," she whispered, though her voice barely carried over the whistling draft. The apartment smelled faintly of old paint and something damp that never quite went away. A single lamp flickered in the corner, casting a weak yellow glow that barely reached the door. The chain lock hung loose, broken weeks ago. The landlord had promised to fix it. Then he stopped answering calls. Rent was due in 4 days. Emily adjusted the frayed rope she had tied from the doorknob to a nail in the wall, pulling it tighter, trying to hold the door in place long enough to keep the heat, what little there was, inside. Her fingers were numb, the kind of cold that settled deep and didn't leave quickly. She glanced back toward the small mattress on the floor where her son lay curled under a thin blanket, his tiny sneakers still by the edge like he might need to run somewhere safe at any moment. The wind pushed again. Harder. The door rattled violently, the rope straining. Emily leaned into it, her breath shaky now. Then footsteps. Slow. Measured. Not from inside. From the hallway. She froze. The building wasn't the kind where people stopped to help. It was the kind where people pretended not to see. The footsteps paused a few feet away. She didn't turn. Not yet. "That hinge is about to give," a calm voice said behind her, low, steady, like it didn't belong in a place like this. Emily tightened her jaw. Of course. Someone watching. Someone noticing. Always at the worst. Moment. "I'm fine," she said quickly, too quickly, still facing the door, still holding it together with everything she had left. A brief silence followed. Then, "You're not." Something about the way he said it, not pity, not judgment, just quiet certainty, made her chest tighten in a way she didn't have time to deal with. She finally turned her head slightly, just enough to catch a glimpse. A man stood a few feet away, tall, clean coat, posture straight like he had never had to lean his body against a broken door in his life. He didn't look away when she met his eyes. Didn't flinch. Didn't rush forward either. Just waited. Emily swallowed, then shook her head. "Don't help me." The words came out firm, even if her voice trembled at the edges. It wasn't pride. It was survival. Help always came with something attached. A look. A favor. A debt she couldn't afford. The man didn't move. His gaze shifted past her, briefly, toward the dim room behind, the flickering light, the small shoes, the quiet cough that broke the silence again. When his eyes returned to her, something had changed. Not louder. Not softer. Just different. The wind slammed the door once more, harder than before, the hinge letting out a sharp metallic groan. Emily flinched, her grip slipping for a split second. That's when he stepped closer. Not rushing. Not asking again. Just closing the distance between where he stood and where everything was about to fall apart. The door jerked again under the pressure of the wind, the rope creaking as if it might snap at any second, and Emily felt her balance falter just enough to remind her how close everything was to giving way when his hand reached out, not touching her, not taking over, just steadying the edge of the door with a firm grip that absorbed the force of the next gust like it was nothing more than a passing inconvenience. And for a moment the rattling stopped, the noise softened, the chaos reduced to a low hum that no longer threatened to spill into the room behind her. She looked at him fully this time, her eyes tired but sharp, searching for the catch, the reason, the expectation that always followed help like a shadow, but his expression did not push, did not demand, it simply stayed, calm and unshaken, as if standing in a cold hallway holding a broken door for a stranger was not something unusual to him. "I said I am fine," she repeated, quieter now, though the strain in her voice betrayed her, and he nodded once, not arguing, not correcting, just acknowledging the words without believing them, his attention already moving to the hinge that hung crooked and loose, the screws barely clinging to the splintered wood. "This will not hold through the night," he said, more to the door than to her, his tone measured, practical, like he was stating a fact that did not need permission to exist. Emily tightened the rope again, pulling it as far as it would go, her fingers brushing against the rough wall as she secured it with a motion she had repeated too many times, each attempt lasting a little less than the last. And behind her, the small cough came again, softer this time but deeper, followed by the faint rustle of blankets. Shifting, the man's gaze flickered past her once more, not lingering, not intruding, just noticing, and something in the way he exhaled told her he had made a decision she was not part of. "There is a hardware store 2 blocks down," he said, releasing the door slowly to test the tension, his hand hovering for a second as the rope held, barely. "They close in 30 minutes. Emily shook her head immediately, almost reflexively. "I do not have time for that," she replied, though what she meant was she did not have money for that, and he seemed to understand the part she did not say, because he did not offer to pay, did not reach for his wallet, did not turn it into a transaction. Instead, he stepped back, giving her space, letting the weight of the door fall back into her control, and for a second she thought that was it, that he would leave like everyone else did, after a glance, after a comment, after deciding it was not their problem. But he did not leave right away. He stood there, watching the way the rope strained, the way the wood shifted with every small movement, the way Emily adjusted her stance to carry the load without showing how heavy it was becoming. "What is your son's name?" he asked suddenly, his voice softer now, and the question caught her off guard, cutting through her defenses in a way offers of help never could. She hesitated, just for a beat, then answered, "Liam." Barely above a whisper, and when she said it, the room behind her felt smaller, more real, more fragile. He nodded again, almost to himself, as if committing the name to memory, then glanced once more at the hinge, the frame, the cracked wood that had been holding on longer than it should. "Keep it closed as much as you can tonight," he said, stepping back toward the hallway, his presence already retreating. "The temperature is dropping below 40. Emily did not respond, she simply watched him, confused by the lack of insistence, by the absence of pressure, by the way he turned and walked away without waiting for thanks, without leaving a card, without asking for anything in return. The hallway swallowed his footsteps quickly, leaving only the sound of the wind and the quiet breathing of her son behind her, and for a long moment she stood there, her hand still on the door, her mind trying to make sense of what had just happened, of why someone who clearly did not belong here had stopped, had noticed, had cared just enough to see what was broken but not enough to force his way into fixing it. Another gust hit the door, the rope stretched, the hinge groaned, and Emily leaned in again, holding it together with everything she had, telling herself the same thing. She always did, that she could manage, that she had to, that she did not need anyone, even as the cold slipped through the cracks and settled deeper into the room than before. The hallway stayed quiet long after his footsteps disappeared, but something about the air felt different, like the cold had settled deeper but the silence had weight now, as if it was holding on to something unfinished. Emily kept her hand pressed against the door, her palm flat against the worn wood, feeling every vibration each time the wind pushed against it, counting the seconds between each gust like it might give her some sense of control. But time did not slow, and the rope did not get stronger, and the hinge did not fix itself. Behind her, Liam shifted again, a soft whimper slipping through the quiet, and that was enough to pull her away from the door for a moment, just long enough to step back and kneel beside the mattress, brushing her fingers gently through his hair, his skin warm but not burning, his breathing uneven but steady enough to let her breathe too. "I am here," she whispered, more to herself than to him, her voice low and steady in a way she did not feel, and for a second, just a second, she let herself imagine what it would be like if someone else could say those words and mean them for her. The door slammed again, louder this time, snapping her back, and she stood quickly, returning to her place, grabbing the handle just as the rope stretched to its limit, the nail in the wall creaking under pressure, and she knew, without needing to test it, that it would not last the night. Her eyes moved toward the small kitchen counter where a stack of unopened mails sat, bills she had stopped opening because the numbers never changed, only the due dates did, and next to them, a nearly empty bottle of cough syrup and a folded receipt from the pharmacy, $48.30 she did not have but had spent anyway because Liam needed it. She swallowed hard, then looked back at the door, at the hinge that hung like it was waiting to fall, and for the first time that night, doubt crept in, not loud, not overwhelming. Just enough to make her wonder if holding everything together alone was actually keeping anything from breaking. Minutes passed, maybe more, the kind of time that stretched without meaning when you were too tired to track it, and then the building shifted into that late-night stillness where even the noise seemed to give up, the wind easing for a moment, the hallway quiet, the world outside moving on without noticing what was happening behind a door that barely closed. Emily adjusted her grip again. Her arms aching now, her shoulders burning in a slow, steady way that told her she could not keep this up much longer, and that was when she heard it, faint at first, then clearer, a metallic sound from down the hallway, not footsteps this time. Something else, deliberate, rhythmic, like tools meeting wood. She froze, her head turning slightly toward the sound, listening, trying to place it, her instincts pulling between caution and something she did not want to name. The noise stopped for a second, then resumed, closer now, steady and controlled, not rushed, not careless, and before she could decide whether to move or stay, a shadow crossed the thin line of light beneath her door, followed by a soft knock, not loud, not demanding. Just enough to be heard. Emily did not answer right away, her grip tightening on the handle, her breath caught somewhere between fear and recognition, and then his voice came through, quieter than before, like it belonged to the night itself. "Keep it closed for a minute." And there was no urgency in it, no pressure, just a simple instruction that somehow carried more reassurance than any promise could. She hesitated, every instinct telling her not to trust, not to rely, not to let go even for a second, but the hinge creaked again, louder now, and her arms trembled from the strain, and slowly, carefully, she shifted her weight, pressing the door shut as tightly as she could from the inside, holding it in place as the sounds outside continued, screws turning, wood adjusting, something being aligned with a precision that did not belong to this building. The cold still slipped through the cracks, but it felt different now, like it was being pushed back inch by inch, and Emily stood there, her forehead resting lightly against the door, listening to the quiet work happening just on the other side, work that asked nothing from her, demanded nothing from her, and for the first time in a long time, she was not the one holding everything together alone. The sound of metal settling into place slowed, then stopped, leaving a silence so complete it felt unfamiliar, like the apartment itself was holding its breath to see if the storm had truly passed. Emily kept her hand against the door for a few seconds longer, her fingers still tense, waiting for the next violent push that never came, and when it did not, she realized something had changed, not loudly, not dramatically, but enough that the wood beneath her palm felt different, steadier, as if it finally belonged where it was meant to be. She eased her grip just slightly, testing it, expecting resistance, expecting that familiar shift, but the door did not move, not even a fraction, and the rope that had been stretched to its limit now hung slack against the wall, no longer needed. Her breath caught quietly in her chest, not quite relief, not quite disbelief. Something in between that she did not trust yet. Outside there was a faint shuffle, then stillness, and for a moment she thought he might knock again, say something, explain, but nothing came, only the distant hum of the building settling into the night. Emily slowly unhooked the rope, her fingers brushing against the rough nail that had been her only solution for weeks, and let it fall to the floor with a soft sound that seemed louder than it should have been. She placed both hands on the door now, pressing gently, then a little harder, feeling the solid resistance push back, firm and certain, and when she turned the knob, it moved smoothly, the latch clicking into place with a quiet, decisive sound that made her close her eyes for a second. Behind her, Liam stirred again, But this time there was no sharp draft cutting through the room, no sudden chill that made him curl tighter under the blanket, just a stillness that allowed his breathing to settle into a softer rhythm. Emily stepped back slowly, her eyes scanning the frame, noticing the clean lines where the hinge had been replaced, the screws set evenly, the wood aligned in a way that did not belong to this apartment but somehow now did, and near the edge of the door, barely noticeable unless you were looking for it, a small folded piece of paper had been tucked into the seam. She hesitated before reaching for it, her hand hovering for a moment as if touching it might change something she was not ready to name. Then she pulled it free and unfolded it carefully. The handwriting was simple, steady, nothing elaborate, just a few words written with intention. No one should sleep in the cold. Emily read it once, then again, her throat tightening in a way that surprised her, because it was not the door, not the repair, not even the timing, it was the absence of anything else, no name, no number, no expectation, just a statement that felt less like a favor and more like a boundary someone had drawn on her behalf. She leaned back against the wall, the paper still in her hand, and for a moment the exhaustion she had been holding at bay all night pressed in, heavy and undeniable, but it was different now. Not crushing, not suffocating, just present, like something she could finally acknowledge without it taking everything from her. The apartment was still small, still worn, the bills still unpaid, the future still uncertain, but the cold had stopped at the door, and that was enough to change the way the room felt, enough to make space for something she had not felt in a long time, something quiet and unfamiliar that settled slowly in her chest. Emily walked back to the mattress and knelt beside Liam, adjusting the blanket around him, her fingers lingering for a second longer than necessary, and as she watched his face relax into sleep, she realized that for the first time in weeks, she was not bracing for the next thing to go wrong. Somewhere down the hallway, a distant door closed, followed by the faint echo of footsteps that did not pause, did not return, and Emily sat there in the dim light, the small piece of paper folded carefully in her hand, understanding without needing proof that whoever had stood on the other side of that door had seen everything she had tried so hard to hold together, and instead of asking her to explain it, he had simply made sure it did not fall apart. Morning arrived quietly, not with sunlight spilling through wide windows, but with a pale gray light that filtered through the thin curtains and settled softly across the room, touching the edges of the newly fixed door as if confirming it was still there. Emily woke before the alarm, her eyes opening slowly, her body still heavy from the night, but something felt different even before she fully moved, something subtle in the air. Something that did not press against her chest the way it usually did. She lay still for a moment, listening, and when she did not hear the whistle of cold air slipping through cracks, when she did not feel that sharp chill on her skin, she turned her head toward the door, and there it was, solid and quiet, exactly as it had been the night before, not shifting, not trembling, just holding. She sat up slowly, pulling the thin blanket aside, her feet touching the cold floor, but it was a different kind of cold now, one that belonged to the morning, not one that invaded. Liam was still asleep, his face relaxed, his breathing even. And for a second Emily just watched him, noticing how his shoulders were not curled in tight, how his small hands rested loosely by his side instead of gripping the blanket, and that alone made something in her chest soften. She stood and walked toward the door, almost cautiously, like approaching something she was afraid might disappear if she moved too quickly, and when her fingers reached the handle, she paused, remembering the way it used to stick, the way she had to twist and pull at the same time, but now it turned smoothly beneath her hand, the latch releasing with a quiet click that felt almost unfamiliar. She opened the door just a few inches, enough to let the hallway light slip in, and the frame did not shift, the hinge did not groan, everything held exactly as it should, and she let out a slow breath she had not realized she was holding. The hallway outside was empty, the worn carpet stretching in both directions. Doors closed, no sign of anyone who might have been there the night before, and for a moment she wondered if she had imagined parts of it, if exhaustion had blurred something into more than it was, but then her fingers brushed against the folded paper still in her other hand, and she knew it had been real. She stepped back inside and closed the door again, testing it one more time, gently pressing against it from the inside, and it did not move, not even slightly. And that certainty settled into her like something steady she could lean on. The small kitchen counter still held the same stack of unopened bills, the same empty spaces where things should have been. Nothing else had changed, and yet everything felt shifted just enough to make the room seem less heavy. She walked over and poured a small glass of water, the faucet dripping slightly before steadying, and took a sip, her mind moving slowly through the morning, already counting hours, shifts, responsibilities. But there was a pause in it now, a small space that had not been there before. Liam stirred behind her, a soft sound pulling her attention back, and she turned quickly, setting the glass down as she moved to his side. Kneeling again as his eyes blinked open, still sleepy, still soft. "Hey," she whispered, brushing his hair back gently, and he looked at her for a second before glancing toward the door, as if noticing something he could not quite name. "It is not cold," he said quietly, his voice simple, stating it like a fact, and Emily nodded, her lips pressing together for a moment before she answered, "No, it is not." And she realized how much that one sentence carried, how much had been taken away just by the absence of that cold. She helped him sit up, adjusting his blanket around his shoulders, and as she did, her eyes drifted once more to the door, to the quiet strength of it standing there without asking for attention, without reminding her of what it had replaced, and for the first time in a long time, she did not feel like she was one step away from everything slipping out of her hands. She did not know who he really was, did not know why he had come back. Did not know what had made him stop in that hallway and decide that her door mattered. But as the morning light settled more fully into the room and the cold stayed outside where it belonged, Emily understood one thing clearly. Sometimes the smallest repairs were not about fixing what was broken, they were about giving someone just enough stability to believe they could keep going. The morning moved forward the way it always did, measured not in minutes but in small decisions that could not be postponed. Emily dressing Liam in layers that did not quite match but kept him warm enough, her fingers moving quickly, efficiently, like she had done this routine so many times it no longer required thought, only motion. The apartment felt quieter now, not silent, but steady, and every time her eyes passed over the door, she felt that same quiet confirmation that something had shifted, something had been put back into place that she did not realize had been missing for so long. She packed Liam's small backpack with careful attention, checking twice for the cough syrup, the folded tissue, the extra socks, each item placed with intention because there was no room for mistakes, not in a life balanced this tightly. When she reached for her coat, she hesitated for a brief second, glancing again at the door, her hand resting on the handle as if she needed to feel it one more time before stepping out into everything waiting beyond it. And when she opened it, the hallway greeted her the same as always: worn carpet, faint smell of old paint, distant sounds of other lives moving in parallel. But she did not brace herself the way she usually did not tense for what might go wrong, she simply stepped forward. The air outside the apartment was colder than inside, but it no longer felt like something chasing her, and Liam held her hand as they walked, his small fingers wrapped tightly around hers, his steps slower than usual but steady. And as they reached the end of the hallway, she glanced once more over her shoulder, the door now closed behind her, standing quietly, doing exactly what it was meant to do. The building stairs creaked under their weight as they made their way down, the morning light growing brighter with each step, and by the time they reached the street, the city had already begun its rhythm, cars passing, people moving quickly with places to be, the kind of motion that did not notice who struggled to keep up. Emily adjusted her grip on Liam's hand and started walking toward the bus stop, her mind already moving through the schedule of the day, her shift at the diner, the hours she needed to cover, the numbers she needed to stretch just far enough to make it to the next week. But beneath all of that, there was something else now, something quieter, a sense that not everything would collapse if one thing went wrong. The bus arrived with a low hiss, and they stepped inside, finding seats near the middle. Liam leaning gently against her side, his head resting just enough to show he was still tired, and Emily placed her arm around him, holding him close as the bus pulled away from the curb. Across the aisle, someone spoke into a phone about deadlines and meetings. words that belonged to a world that felt far from hers, and she did not pay attention until a name caught her ear, spoken casually, almost as an afterthought. Hayes Corporation is closing that deal today. It is all over the news. And Emily's gaze lifted slightly, not because the name meant anything to her, but because something about it felt familiar in a way she could not place. She shook the thought away quickly, focusing instead on Liam as he shifted beside her, his breathing calm, his body warm, and she adjusted his scarf gently, making sure it sat properly around his neck. The bus moved through the city, stopping and starting, people getting on and off, each carrying their own stories, their own weight. And Emily sat quietly among them, her thoughts returning once more, unexpectedly, to the hallway, to the steady presence of someone who had not asked permission to care, who had not waited to be thanked, who had simply seen something broken and decided it did not have to stay that way. She did not know his name, did not know anything about where he came from or where he had gone, but as the bus carried them further into the morning, she found herself holding on to something she had not allowed herself to feel in a long time, not hope exactly, not yet, but the beginning of something close to it, something that started not with a promise, but with a door that finally stayed closed when it needed to. The diner smelled like coffee that had been poured too many times and pancakes that had stayed on the grill just a second too long, the kind of place where time did not stop but it also did not rush, and Emily moved through it with quiet efficiency, her hands steady even when her mind was not, balancing plates, refilling cups, offering small smiles that did not ask for anything in return. The morning crowd had already thinned, leaving behind the low hum of conversations and the occasional clink of silverware against ceramic, and for a moment, just a moment, she allowed herself to breathe between orders, her back resting lightly against the counter, as she watched the sunlight filter through the front windows, softer than it had been in days. "You look different today," her coworker Jenna said as she passed by, her tone casual but observant, and Emily glanced at her, unsure how to answer, because nothing had changed in a way that could be easily explained, and yet everything felt slightly steadier. "Did you finally get some sleep?" Jenna added, pouring coffee into a waiting mug, and Emily gave a small nod, not entirely a lie, not entirely the truth, because rest had not come from sleep, it had come from something else, something she could not quite put into words. A bell chimed softly as the front door opened, letting in a brief rush of cooler air before closing again, and Emily turned instinctively, the motion automatic after years of working here, ready to greet the next customer, but the words caught in her throat before they formed, because for a second, just a second, something about the figure standing near the entrance felt familiar in a way she could not immediately explain. He stood still, taking in the space without looking out of place, his coat darker than most in the room, his posture the same quiet certainty she had seen the night before, and even before her mind caught up, something in her chest tightened slightly, like recognition arriving before confirmation. He did not look around like someone searching for attention, did not scan the room with impatience, he simply stepped forward and chose a seat near the window, his movements unhurried, deliberate, as if he belonged wherever he decided to be. Emily turned away quickly, focusing on the tray in her hands, her pulse just slightly faster than before, telling herself it could not be him, that it did not make sense for someone like that to appear here, in a place like this, in the middle of a regular morning that had nothing to do with last night. But the thought stayed, persistent, quiet. Jenna nudged her lightly as she passed. "Table 6, she said with a small smile, unaware of the shift happening just beneath the surface, and Emily nodded, her steps measured as she approached, each movement controlled in a way that hid the uncertainty she felt. When she reached the table, she set the glass of water down first, her eyes focused on the simple act, and then she looked up, just enough to confirm what she already knew. And there he was, the same calm expression, the same steady presence, unchanged by the different setting. As if the hallway and the diner were simply two places on the same path for him. For a moment, either of them spoke, and the noise of the diner seemed to soften around them, not disappearing, but fading just enough to make space for something quieter. Emily felt the words rise before she could stop them, not rehearsed, not planned, just honest in a way she rarely allowed herself to be. You came back, she said, her voice low but clear, and he held her gaze for a second before answering, his tone as steady as it had been the night before. I did not leave anything unfinished. And the simplicity of it settled between them, not heavy, not complicated, just enough to shift something again, this time not in a hallway, not behind a door, but in the space between two people who had met without meaning to, and somehow, without asking, had already changed each other's morning. Emily stood there for a moment longer than necessary, her hand still lightly resting on the edge of the table as if letting go too quickly might break something fragile she did not fully understand yet, and he did not rush her, did not fill the silence with unnecessary words. He simply sat there with the same quiet presence that had followed him from the hallway into this small diner, as if the setting had changed but he had not. She cleared her throat softly, grounding herself back into the rhythm she knew, the one that did not allow space for confusion. What can I get you? She asked, her voice steady again, professional, familiar, and he glanced briefly at the menu before answering. Coffee is fine. Like it was the simplest choice in a place where simplicity mattered, she nodded and stepped away, her movements automatic, but her thoughts no longer were, because something about his answer, about the way he had returned without explanation, without expectation, lingered in her mind in a way that disrupted the careful order she usually kept. She poured the coffee slowly, watching the dark liquid fill the cup, steady and consistent, and for a second she focused on that, on the small control of it, before turning back toward his table. When she set the cup down in front of him, he gave a slight nod, not a gesture of habit, but one of acknowledgement, and Emily found herself noticing the small details now, the way his hands rested calmly on the table, the absence of any sign that he needed to prove anything to anyone in this room. The door, she said quietly, the words coming out before she could decide whether she wanted to say them, and he looked up at her, his expression unchanged, attentive but not expectant, and she continued. You did not have to do that. Because that was the truth she knew, the one she had lived by, that no one ever had to do anything for anyone else, not without a reason. He held her gaze for a second before answering, his voice calm, almost matter-of-fact. I know. And there was no explanation after it, no justification, just a simple acknowledgement that he had made a choice without needing her to understand it. Emily felt something shift again, smaller this time but deeper, because she had expected a reason, a story, something that would make sense of it in the way she understood the world, but he offered none, and that absence made the act itself feel more real, more deliberate. Most people would not, she said, her tone softer now, less guarded, and he nodded slightly. Most people do not stop long enough to see what matters, he replied, his words not heavy, not dramatic, just stated like something he had learned rather than something he wanted to teach. Emily glanced away briefly, her eyes moving toward the front window where the sunlight had shifted slightly higher, catching the edge of the glass and reflecting faintly across the floor, and she realized she did not know what to do with this moment, with this conversation that did not follow the rules she was used to. From behind the counter, Jenna called out an order, the familiar sound pulling Emily back, reminding her that the day was still moving, that time did not pause for moments like this, and she nodded quickly, stepping back from the table. I will be right back, she said, though she was not sure why she said it, because he had not asked her to stay. As she moved away, she could feel his presence still there, not pressing, not demanding, just existing in the same space with a kind of quiet certainty that did not fade when she looked away. The diner continued. Around them, plates being set down, conversations rising and falling, the ordinary rhythm of a place that had seen countless mornings just like this one, and yet for Emily, something about this morning felt set apart, not because of something loud or dramatic, but because of something steady and intentional that had carried from a cold hallway into a warm room. When she returned a few minutes later, he was still there. Exactly where she had left him, his coffee untouched, his gaze directed out the window as if he was watching something beyond the street, something only he could see, and for a second she wondered what kind of life allowed someone to move so easily between worlds that did not usually intersect. She placed a small plate on the table without thinking, a simple piece of toast that had been extra something she would normally clear away, and when he looked back at her, there was a brief flicker of something in his eyes. Not surprise exactly, but recognition of the gesture. And Emily realized she had just done something she did not usually do, something small, unasked, given without a reason she could explain. Neither of them spoke about it, but the moment settled quietly between them, not as a transaction, not as something owed, but as something shared, and as Emily stepped back once more into the flow of the diner, she understood, slowly, that whatever had begun with a broken door had not ended when it was fixed. It had simply opened something else she had not expected to find. The rhythm of the diner continued to move around her, steady and predictable, but Emily felt slightly out of sync with it now, like her thoughts were walking just half a step behind her actions, and every time she passed by table 6, she was aware of him without looking, aware of the quiet space that seemed to follow him even in a room full of noise. He had not touched the toast yet, and his coffee sat warm in front of him, a thin line of steam still rising, untouched not out of neglect but as if he had not come here for the coffee at all. Emily moved between tables, refilling cups, clearing plates, responding to small requests with practiced ease, but her attention kept drifting back, pulled by something she did not fully understand, something that did not feel like curiosity alone. A few tables away, two men in pressed shirts spoke in low voices, their conversation cutting through the background just enough to catch certain words. "Hayes Corporation is making another acquisition," one of them said, scrolling through something on his phone. "The CEO does not even show up to most of these meetings anymore, everything just gets handled." And the other gave a small laugh. "When you are worth that much, I guess you do not have to." And Emily felt a faint flicker of recognition again, that same name from the bus, landing softly in her mind without context, without meaning, just present. She glanced toward table 6 again, this time a little longer, noticing the way he sat, not distracted, not impatient, simply present in a way that did not match the image those men had just described, and for a second the two ideas did not align, could not connect. And she let the thought go, returning to the task in front of her. When she approached his table again, it was not with hesitation this time, but with a quiet awareness that something unspoken had already been established between them, something that did not require explanation. "You have not touched your coffee," she said, her tone light but genuine, and he looked at the cup briefly before answering. "I am waiting." And she tilted her head slightly, not understanding. "For what?" she asked. And he met her eyes again, that same calm steadiness in his expression. "For the moment to feel like it belongs," he said, and the answer did not make immediate sense, but it stayed with her in a way that made her stop trying to define it. Emily nodded slowly, not because she fully understood, but because something about the way he said it felt true in a way she did not need to question. Behind her, the bell at the door chimed again, and a new group entered, louder, more hurried, bringing with them the energy of the outside world that did not slow down for quiet conversations or moments that needed time to settle. Jenna called her name from across the room, and Emily responded instinctively, stepping back into the pace she knew. But as she moved away, she noticed something else, something small but impossible to ignore now, the way the other customers looked at him, not directly, not obviously, but with a kind of subtle awareness, like they recognized something they could not quite place, a presence that did not belong to the ordinary flow of the diner. She followed that thought only briefly before letting it go, because her world did not allow space for assumptions, only for what was in front of her, and what was in front of her was a man who had fixed her door without asking, who had returned without explaining, and who now sat quietly in a place that had never held anything extraordinary before. When the rush picked up again, Emily found herself moving faster, the pace demanding her full attention, orders stacking, voices overlapping, the kind of controlled chaos she had learned to navigate without thinking. And for a while, the moment faded into the background, replaced by the immediate needs of the room. But every time she passed by table 6, even in the middle of everything, she felt it again, that quiet shift, that subtle change in the air, like something had entered her world without permission and without disruption, simply existing alongside it, steady and patient. And as the morning moved forward, Emily realized something she had not expected. She was no longer trying to understand why he had helped her, or why he had come back. She was simply beginning to accept that sometimes the reason did not come first, sometimes the action did, and everything else followed after. By late morning the diner had filled again, the soft hum turning into a steady wave of voices and movement that demanded attention in every direction, and Emily moved through it with practiced precision, her tray balanced carefully, her steps quick but controlled, yet beneath that rhythm something quieter remained, something that did not fade even as the room grew louder. Table 6 stayed anchored in her awareness, not as a distraction, but as a point of stillness she kept returning to without meaning to. And when she finally had a moment to pause near the counter, she noticed something new. The coffee in front of him was no longer steaming, but it was no longer untouched either, a small detail, but one that marked time passing in a way she had not been tracking. Jenna leaned beside her, wiping down the counter with a cloth, her eyes flicking briefly toward the window before returning to Emily with a subtle lift of her brow. "You know him?" she asked casually, though the question carried a hint of curiosity that had been building unnoticed, and Emily shook her head. Lightly, her answer simple. "No." But it felt incomplete even as she said it, because knowing someone was not always about names or history, sometimes it was about moments that stayed with you. Jenna followed her gaze again, studying him for a second longer. "He does not look like he belongs here," she added, not judgmental, just observant, and Emily glanced back at him, seeing what Jenna meant, the quiet composure, the absence of restlessness, the way he seemed unaffected by the shifting energy around him, and yet, she thought, either did she, not in the way she used to. "Maybe he just needed coffee," Emily replied, though the words felt lighter than the truth she was beginning to sense, and Jenna gave a small shrug before moving on, leaving Emily alone with the thought. When Emily returned to his table, it was not out of obligation this time, but something closer to intention, and she noticed that the toast she had left earlier was gone, not eaten hurriedly, but finished in a way that suggested it had been appreciated, and that small detail settled something in her, a quiet confirmation that what she had offered had been received without being turned into something more. "Can I get you anything else?" she asked, her voice softer now, less formal, and he looked up at her, his expression unchanged but attentive. "No, this is enough," he said, and there was a weight to the word enough that made it feel like more than just a response about food or drink. Emily hesitated for a moment, then found herself asking, "Why did you really come here?" Not accusing, not demanding, just honest, and the question lingered between them without urgency. He did not answer immediately, his gaze shifting briefly toward the window, where the light had grown stronger, reflecting off passing cars and casting faint moving patterns across the table, and when he spoke, his voice was quiet, steady. "Because I wanted to see if what I fixed stayed fixed." And Emily felt the words settle deeper than she expected, because she understood now he was not just talking about the door. She nodded slowly, her eyes dropping for a second before lifting again. "It did," she said, and her voice carried something new in it, not just confirmation, but a kind of quiet gratitude that did not need to be spoken directly. For a moment, neither of them moved, and the noise of the diner seemed to blur slightly at the edges, not disappearing, but no longer pressing in as strongly, and Emily realized she was no longer thinking about the gap between their worlds, no longer trying to place him into something she understood. She was simply standing there, present in the same moment, letting it exist. Without needing to define it, from across the room, the bell chimed again, another customer entering, another shift in the flow, and Emily stepped back slightly, knowing she had to return to it, to the movement that defined her day. But something held her there for just 1 second longer, something unspoken but understood. "Thank you," she said finally, the words simple, but carrying everything she had not said the night before, and he gave a small nod, not dismissing it, not amplifying it. Just accepting it in the same quiet way he had done everything else. As she turned away, returning to the pace of the diner, Emily felt something settle into place inside her, not a resolution, not a conclusion, but a shift, a small realignment that made the weight she carried feel just slightly more balanced, and as the day moved forward, she understood that whatever had started with a broken door had now moved beyond it, into something less visible but just as real, something that did not fix everything, but changed enough to make everything else feel possible. The afternoon light shifted slowly across the diner floor, stretching longer now, softer, as the rush began to ease and the space between conversations grew just wide enough for thoughts to settle again. And Emily found herself noticing the quiet return of that stillness, the same kind that had followed him into the room earlier, the same kind that now lingered even as the last of the lunch crowd filtered out. Table 6 was no longer occupied, the chair pushed in neatly, the coffee cup empty, but placed carefully near the edge as if it had been set down with intention rather than left behind, and Emily paused for a second when she saw it, her steps slowing just enough to mark the absence. She walked over, not because she had to clear it immediately, but because something about the way he had left felt deliberate, like a moment that had been closed quietly without announcement. When she reached the table, her fingers rested lightly on the cup, still faintly warm, and for a brief second she let herself stand there, taking in the simplicity of what remained, no note, no message, nothing to explain or extend what had already been said. She picked up the cup and plate, her movements slower now, thoughtful, and as she turned to head back toward the counter, Jenna's voice broke the silence. "Your quiet guy just paid," she said, holding up a small receipt with a curious look. "And he left a tip that does not match this place." And Emily paused, her eyes shifting toward the receipt without reaching for it, not because she did not want to see it, but because she already understood what it meant. "Did he say anything?" Emily asked, her voice calm but carrying a subtle weight, and Jenna shook her head. "No, just nodded and left, like he was not trying to be noticed." And there was something in that detail that felt exactly right. Emily gave a small nod, returning to her routine, setting the cup down in the sink, rinsing it out with steady hands, the water running over it in a quiet stream that filled the space where words might have gone. The diner continued to wind down, chairs being adjusted, tables wiped clean, the kind of end to a shift that did not announce itself but arrived naturally, and Emily moved through it all with the same efficiency she always had. But something inside her felt different now, not lighter exactly, but more aligned, like something had been placed back into position without her needing to carry it anymore. When her shift finally ended, she removed her apron slowly, folding it with care before placing it in the locker, her hands lingering for a moment as if acknowledging the transition from one part of her day to the next, and as she stepped outside, the air greeted her with a chill that felt familiar but no longer overwhelming. The street was busy in its own way, people moving with purpose, cars passing in steady lines, the city continuing its rhythm without pause, and Emily adjusted her coat as she began the walk toward the bus stop, her steps measured but unhurried. As she walked, her mind drifted briefly back to the diner, to the empty chair, to the quiet way he had left without asking for anything more, and she realized something then. Something that settled into her with a clarity she had not expected. He had not come back to be thanked, he had not stayed to be known, he had simply returned to make sure that what he had done mattered beyond the moment itself. The bus arrived with its usual sound, the doors opening with a soft hiss, and Emily stepped inside, finding a seat near the window this time, her gaze moving across the passing buildings as the city slid by in familiar patterns. The sunlight had shifted lower now, casting longer shadows, and as she watched it move across the glass, she found herself thinking not about what had been fixed, but about what had been seen, about the quiet recognition of a struggle she had never spoken aloud, and how someone had answered it without asking her to explain. When the bus stopped near her street, she stepped off and made her way toward the building, her pace steady, her mind quieter than it had been in a long time, and as she reached the stairs and began to climb, she felt it again, that subtle awareness of something waiting, not uncertain, not fragile, but steady. When she reached her door, she paused for just a moment, her hand resting on the handle before turning it, and when it opened smoothly, just as it had that morning, she stepped inside, the warmth holding, the silence calm, and, for the first time since everything had shifted, she allowed herself to fully feel it, not just the relief of what had been fixed, but the quiet understanding that sometimes, the most important changes were not the ones that stayed visible, but the ones that stayed with you long after the person who made them was gone. The apartment welcomed her back with a quiet that no longer felt empty, but settled, like something had finally chosen to stay instead of slipping through the cracks, and Emily closed the door behind her with a soft click that carried more certainty than it ever had before. Liam was already sitting up on the mattress, his small hands clutching the edge of the blanket as he looked toward her with a faint smile that had more energy than the morning, and she crossed the room quickly, setting her bag down before kneeling beside him, brushing her fingers gently across his forehead, checking without thinking, and when she felt only warmth instead of fever, something in her chest eased just a little more. "You look better," she said softly, and he nodded, his voice still quiet but stronger. "It is not cold anymore," he repeated, as if that one change explained everything, and in a way, it did. Emily helped him to his feet, guiding him toward the small kitchen area where the light from the window now reached further into the room, catching the edge of the counter and reflecting softly off the glass she had left there that morning. And as she moved through the space, she noticed how her steps felt different, not lighter, but more grounded, like she was no longer bracing against something unseen. She prepared a simple meal, nothing more than what she had, bread warmed slightly on the stove, a small portion divided carefully, and Liam sat at the table watching her with the kind of quiet patience children learn too early, and when she placed the plate in front of him, he smiled again, a small expression that carried more weight than it should have, because it was no longer shaped by discomfort or distraction. The afternoon stretched slowly, the kind of time that did not demand anything immediate. And for once, Emily allowed herself to sit for a moment, her hands resting in her lap as she looked around the apartment, seeing it not just as a place she endured, but as a space that had shifted in a way she could feel even if she could not fully explain it. Her eyes moved again to the door, to the clean lines of the hinge, the way it held firm without effort, and she stood, almost without thinking, walking toward it, and placing her hand against the surface, not to hold it in place, but simply to feel it, to confirm that it was still real. For a moment, she stayed there, her palm flat against the wood, her thoughts quiet, and then she turned the knob slightly, opening it just enough to look out into the hallway, half expecting to see someone, but it was empty, just as it had been before, the same worn carpet, the same muted light, no sign of anything that would explain how something so simple had changed so much. She closed the door again gently, the latch settling into place with that same soft certainty, and as she stepped back, she noticed something she had missed earlier, a small detail near the bottom edge of the frame, where the wood met the floor, a faint mark that had not been there before, not damage, not wear, but something new, something subtle that indicated the door had been adjusted, reinforced, made to last beyond a single night. Emily knelt down slightly, her fingers brushing near the edge, and for a second, she felt a strange sense of reassurance. Not just in the repair itself, but in the intention behind it, the idea that someone had not only fixed what was broken, but had thought about what might happen next, had prepared for it without needing to be asked. Behind her, Liam called her name softly, and she turned quickly, the moment shifting back into the present as she moved toward him again, helping him with his cup, adjusting his blanket when he sat back down, her attention returning to the small, immediate things that made up her world. But even as she moved through those familiar motions, something stayed with her, something steady and quiet, like a thread that connected what had happened the night before to this moment now. Not as a memory, but as a presence that had changed the way she experienced everything around her. The light outside began to fade slowly, the afternoon giving way to evening, and Emily turned on the small lamp in the corner, the same soft glow filling the room, but it no longer felt like it was fighting against the darkness, it simply existed alongside it. As she sat beside Liam, listening to his breathing even out again, she realized that whatever had happened had not solved everything, had not erased the challenges waiting for her tomorrow, but it had done something just as important. It had shown her, quietly and without demand, that not everything she faced had to be carried alone, and sometimes, the strongest kind of help was the kind that left no trace except the way it changed how you moved forward. The night settled in slowly, not as a sudden darkness, but as a quiet dimming of everything around her, the small apartment softening under the warm glow of the lamp while the world outside continued its distant rhythm, cars passing, voices fading, life moving forward without needing to be noticed. Emily sat beside Liam, her back resting lightly against the wall, her eyes tracing the gentle rise and fall of his breathing as sleep returned to him more easily than it had in days, and she let herself stay there a little longer than necessary, not because she had nothing to do, but because for once, she did not feel the urgency to move. The room felt different at night now, not because it had changed in size or shape, but because it no longer felt like something she had to guard every second, and her gaze drifted once more toward the door, standing quietly in place, holding its purpose without effort, without reminder. Just there, doing what it was meant to do, she stood slowly, careful not to disturb Liam, and walked toward it again, her hand brushing lightly across the surface, not to test it, not to hold it, but simply to acknowledge it, and for a moment she rested her forehead gently against the wood, her eyes closing as she let the stillness settle fully around her. She did not know where he was now. Did not know what kind of life allowed someone to move through the world the way he did, stepping into moments without hesitation and leaving them without expectation, but she knew what he had left behind, not just a repaired door, but a shift she could feel in the way she stood, the way she breathed, the way she no longer felt like everything depended on her holding it together alone. She stepped back and turned off the lamp, the room falling into a softer darkness that no longer felt threatening, and as she made her way back to the mattress, she lay down beside Liam, pulling the blanket over them both, her arm resting lightly around him as she closed her eyes. For a while, sleep did not come immediately, not because of worry, but because her mind moved through the day, through the hallway, the diner, the quiet conversation that had never needed to be long to matter, and she realized something she had not allowed herself to think before, that maybe strength was not just about enduring. Maybe it was also about recognizing when something good entered your life and letting it exist without pushing it away. The hours passed quietly, the night deepening, and when she finally drifted into sleep, it was not the restless kind that came from exhaustion, but something steadier, something that held. Morning came again, the light returning slowly through the thin curtains, touching the edges of the room in the same gentle way, and Emily woke to the sound of Liam shifting beside her, his small voice murmuring something soft and half-formed as he opened his eyes. She smiled faintly, brushing his hair back as she sat up, the familiar rhythm of the day waiting just beyond the moment, but it did not feel as heavy as it once had. She stood and walked toward the door once more, not out of habit now, but out of something closer to gratitude, her hand resting briefly on the handle before turning it, opening it just enough to let the morning air in, fresh and cool but no longer intrusive, just part of the world outside. She closed it again gently, the latch settling into place with that same quiet certainty, and as she turned back toward the room, toward Liam, toward everything that still needed to be done, she carried something with her that had not been there before, not something loud or dramatic, but something steady, something that did not demand attention to exist, and as she moved forward into the day, she understood in a way she had never quite felt before. He had not changed her life in a single moment, he had simply reminded her that even in the hardest places, kindness could still find its way in, and sometimes, that was enough to change everything.